I wasn't digging through anything with bad intentions, at least not at first, and I kept telling myself that even as my fingers closed around the smooth edge of something that definitely wasn't a key. I had torn apart the living room, checked the hooks by the door, even looked in the refrigerator out of pure desperation, because somehow that's where things end up when you're tired and distracted, and still, my car keys were nowhere to be found. Saren's handbag sat on the corner of the kitchen island, half unzipped, the way she always left it when she came home in a hurry, and I figured I'd probably toss the keys in there without thinking. Instead, my hand brushed against a thin plastic card tucked into a side pocket, and when I pulled it out, I saw a pale rectangle with a blue stripe and a corporate logo I didn't recognize at first. It took a second for my brain to catch up and realize it was a hotel key card, the kind you get slipped into a paper sleeve at a front desk that smells like carpet cleaner and burnt coffee. My first thought was confusion, not suspicion, because we hadn't stayed anywhere overnight in a long time, not since a rushed anniversary trip that ended with us arguing about directions and eating lukewarm takeout in silence. I turned the card over, then noticed there was another one behind it, and when I pulled that out too, they matched perfectly, same brand, same color, same tiny printed numbers near the bottom that read 417. My chest tightened in a way I didn't like, but I still reached back into the pocket, telling myself there had to be some reasonable explanation, that maybe she'd gone to a work seminar or helped a friend who locked themselves out of a room. 3 more cards came out in my hand, all identical, all marked with the same room number, and when I lined them up on the counter, I saw faint handwriting on the back of each one, different dates spaced a week apart, all of them falling on the same weekday. I stood there listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a lawn mower outside, feeling like the floor had quietly shifted a few inches to the left while I wasn't looking, and for the first time in years, I realized how fragile the shape of my life really was. I checked the calendar on my phone with hands that didn't quite feel like they belonged to me anymore, and the pattern snapped into place with a kind of cruel precision that made my stomach turn. Those dates all lined up with the evenings Saren said she was meeting with her reading group, the one she joined in early winter after coming home excited about finally having something that was hers, something that got her out of the house and away from the same walls we'd both been staring at for too long. I remembered how normal it had sounded when she first mentioned it over dinner, how she'd shrugged and said they were just a few coworkers who wanted an excuse to talk about novels and drink cheap wine, and how I'd smiled and told her it was a good idea without giving it a second thought. For months, every Tuesday evening, she'd leave around sunset, promise not to wake me when she got back, and return a few hours later smelling like perfume and whatever bar they'd chosen that week, her cheeks a little flushed, her mood lighter than it had been in a long time. I told myself that was what happiness looked like, that I should be glad she'd found something that made her feel less trapped by our routines. Standing in that kitchen with 5 pieces of plastic evidence lined up like silent witnesses, I finally admitted that I didn't believe my own excuses anymore. I called the hotel using the number printed on the back of one of the cards, and when a polite voice answered, I asked, as casually as I could manage, whether room 417 was available that night because I thought I'd left something behind. There was a pause filled with keyboard clicks, and then the voice told me the room wasn't free, that it was reserved on a recurring basis for the same guest every week. The words settled into me slowly, like cold water seeping through fabric, and I thanked them and hung up without saying anything else, staring at my reflection in the dark screen of my phone and barely recognizing the person looking back. The rest of that day passed in a haze of half-finished tasks and conversations I couldn't focus on, and when Saren texted to say her meeting might run late and that I shouldn't wait up, I stared at the message longer than necessary before replying with a short, neutral sentence that didn't hint at the storm building in my head. I told her I was going for a late workout, grabbed a gym bag that was empty except for a towel, and drove in the opposite direction, toward the edge of town where the roads widen and the buildings get shorter and more anonymous. The hotel looked exactly like every other place designed for people who didn't want to be remembered. 3 stories of beige walls, a parking lot lit by buzzing lamps, a lobby that probably sold the same snacks and the same regrets every night. I parked where I could see the entrance without being seen too easily and waited, counting my breaths, telling myself I could still turn around and go home if I wanted to, that nothing irreversible had happened yet. When Saren's car finally pulled in, I recognized it instantly, watched her step out and smooth her jacket, check her phone, and walk inside with a confidence that made something in my chest ache in a way I couldn't name. I followed a few minutes later, keeping my distance, stopping at the end of the corridor where I could see her door without being obvious, and I watched her swipe a card and disappear into a room that I suddenly hated without ever having seen the inside of it. When a man came out a little while later, someone older than me, well-dressed, moving with the easy assurance of someone who rarely gets told no, I understood everything and nothing at the same time, and I walked back to my car without knocking, without shouting, without doing any of the things you imagine you'd do in a moment like that. Because sometimes shock doesn't look like drama. It looks like quiet, steady breathing and a road unfolding in front of you that you didn't know you were about to walk alone. I drove without music, without a destination, just letting the headlights carve a narrow tunnel through the dark, while my thoughts piled up faster than I could sort them. And by the time I realized I was gripping the steering wheel hard enough to make my hands ache, I had already passed the turn for our neighborhood. The image of her walking into that room kept replaying in my head, not like a dramatic scene from a movie, but like a small, ordinary betrayal, the kind that hurts more because of how routine it seems. When I finally pulled over, it was in the lot of a run-down diner that stayed open all night for truckers and insomniacs, and I sat there watching the steam from the kitchen vents curl into the cold air, trying to remember when my life had stopped feeling like something I was actively choosing and started feeling like something that just happened to me. I thought about the way Saren and I used to talk for hours when we first moved in together, about the lists we made of places we wanted to see, projects we wanted to start, conversations we swore we'd never stop having, and I couldn't pinpoint the exact moment those lists got replaced by shared calendars and reminders about trash day. At some point, I must have fallen asleep in the car, because I woke up with a stiff neck and a pale line of dawn creeping over the horizon, my phone buzzing with missed messages I didn't read, and the strange realization that nothing had actually ended yet, even though something fundamental already had. I went home, showered, changed, and answered emails like a person who still belonged to his own life, all while knowing that the version of me who had woken up that morning was not the same one who had gone to bed the night before. Over the next several days, I moved through my routines with a kind of careful detachment, the way you do when you're carrying something fragile and dangerous at the same time, and I watched Saren with a new set of eyes that noticed details I'd ignored for years. The way she checked her phone and then set it face down, the way she smiled at messages she didn't share, the way she seemed lighter and more distant all at once, as if part of her was already somewhere else. I didn't confront her, not because I was afraid of the truth, but because I wanted to understand the shape of it before I touched it, to see how big it really was and how much space it had already taken up in our lives. When I finally did sit her down one evening and asked her directly where she'd been going all those nights, the room felt smaller, like the walls were leaning in to listen, and when I laid the key cards on the table between us, her face changed in a way I'd never seen before, not guilt exactly, but something closer to exhaustion, as if she'd been carrying this secret for a long time and was suddenly relieved to put it down. She didn't deny it, not really, and she didn't offer excuses that made any sense either, just told me that she'd felt invisible for a long time and that someone else had noticed, and that noticing had slowly turned into something she didn't know how to stop. I remember thinking how strange it was that 2 people could use the same words, tired, lonely, stuck, and mean completely different things by them, and how unfair it felt that understanding her reasons didn't make what she'd done hurt any less. The man, it turned out, wasn't a stranger at all, but someone whose name I'd heard in passing more times than I could count. Someone who had a reputation for being charming and effective and untouchable in the way people with the right connections often are. And the more I learned, the more it became clear that this wasn't some reckless, impulsive mistake, but a carefully managed arrangement that fit neatly into the gaps of his schedule. That realization did something unexpected to me, because it shifted my anger from a burning, unfocused thing into something colder and more deliberate, something that wanted not just to react, but to correct an imbalance that suddenly felt too big to ignore. I started paying attention in a different way, asking quiet questions, noticing patterns, and when I finally saw proof that he had a whole other life built on the assumption that no one would ever bother to look too closely, I understood that the story wasn't just about my marriage falling apart anymore. It was about the way some people treat honesty like a luxury and other people like they're disposable, and about how easy it is to keep a lie alive as long as everyone around you benefits from it staying hidden. By the time I made the decision to step out of my own shock and do something that would force the truth into the open, I wasn't acting out of revenge so much as a strange, steady sense of fairness, the kind that doesn't feel heroic or dramatic, just necessary, like finally setting a bone that's been broken for too long. Once the decision settled in my mind, it didn't arrive with fireworks or a dramatic speech to myself, just a quiet certainty that felt heavier than anger and more stable than fear, and I carried it with me through the days like a second spine. I found a lawyer through a coworker who spoke about him the way people talk about mechanics who fix things that can't be fixed, with a mix of gratitude and resignation, and in a small office that smelled faintly of old paper and strong coffee, I told a version of my story that sounded strangely flat when spoken out loud, as if it belonged to someone else. He listened without interrupting, asked questions that were precise and unemotional, and explained what the next steps would look like in terms that made the end of my marriage feel less like a personal catastrophe and more like a complicated administrative process, which was both comforting and deeply unsettling. I moved into a short-term apartment with mismatched furniture and thin walls, a place that echoed in unfamiliar ways, and I discovered that loneliness doesn't always feel like sadness. Sometimes it feels like relief mixed with disorientation, like stepping off a moving walkway and realizing your legs have forgotten how to stand still. Saren tried to reach me at first, leaving messages that shifted from apologies to anger to something that sounded like bargaining. But I let my lawyer handle the communication because I didn't trust myself to hear her voice without wanting to believe a version of her that no longer existed. In the quiet of those evenings, I started noticing how many parts of my life I'd been sleepwalking through, how many conversations I'd half listened to, how many questions I'd stopped asking because the answers felt inconvenient, and that awareness hurt in a way that was strangely productive, like muscles burning during a workout you didn't know you needed. The more I learned about the man she'd been seeing, the clearer the shape of his double life became, not through dramatic revelations but through small, almost boring details that added up to something undeniable, like the way he paid for certain things in cash, or how he always scheduled meetings that ran just long enough to justify being late for dinner, or how his public image was carefully curated to look effortless and generous. It wasn't difficult to find information once I started looking with intention, and what surprised me most was not how elaborate his deception was, but how ordinary it looked from the outside, how much it resembled the quiet compromises people make every day when they assume they won't be caught. His spouse, from everything I could see, lived in a world that had been carefully insulated from that reality, full of community events and shared photos and comments from friends who believed in the story they were being shown. And I realized that, in a way, she was the last person still trapped in a version of the lie that had already unraveled for everyone else involved. I didn't feel triumphant when I thought about telling her, and I didn't feel cruel either, just aware that there are some truths that don't belong to the people who are hiding them, and that keeping them buried is a kind of ongoing harm that spreads quietly the longer it's allowed to exist. When the evidence was finally passed along through the proper channels, it felt less like a dramatic confrontation and more like closing a door that had been left open for too long, letting cold air into a room where people had been pretending everything was warm. The fallout, when it came, moved faster than I expected and slower than I wanted, unfolding in news filtered through second-hand conversations and brief updates from my lawyer. And I watched from a distance as careers, routines, and carefully maintained appearances began to shift under the weight of information that could no longer be ignored. Saren's life changed in ways she hadn't planned for, and though part of me wanted to feel vindicated, what I mostly felt was a tired kind of acceptance, the understanding that consequences don't arrive to satisfy anyone's sense of narrative justice. They arrive because actions have momentum and eventually run into something solid. The legal process ground forward with its own indifferent rhythm, dividing up years of shared choices into lists and signatures and boxes that had to be checked. And somewhere in the middle of that, I noticed that I was sleeping better, laughing more easily, and making plans that didn't automatically include someone else's preferences. It wasn't happiness yet, not in the simple way people like to talk about, but it was space. And space turned out to be more valuable than I'd realized, because it gave me room to hear my own thoughts without translating them into compromises first. I started walking more, reading things I'd put off, saying yes to invitations I would have declined out of habit, and little by little, my life began to feel less like a reaction to something that had happened to me and more like something I was actively, imperfectly building again. It was months later, in a place that smelled of roasted coffee beans and quiet conversations, that I saw her for the first time without the weight of anger sitting between my shoulders, and the strangeness of that moment surprised me more than the meeting itself. She was sitting alone near the window, turning the pages of a book with the kind of distracted focus that comes from reading without really reading, and for a second I considered walking past and letting the moment dissolve into another story I'd tell myself later about almost doing something. Instead, I said her name, and when she looked up, recognition flickered across her face, followed by something that looked like cautious relief, as if she'd been bracing for this conversation without knowing when it would arrive. We talked in the careful way people do, when they both know there are too many old wounds to pretend nothing happened, but also too much shared understanding to reduce each other to strangers. And in that hour I learned that endings don't always come with a clean emotional line drawn under them. Sometimes they come with an awkward, honest conversation over cooling drinks and the mutual acknowledgement that whatever we were trying to protect before had already changed beyond repair. She didn't ask for forgiveness, and I didn't offer it in any grand, ceremonial way, but there was a quiet sense of closure in realizing that neither of us was still arguing with the past. We were just finally letting it sit where it belonged. Not long after that, I ran into the other person whose life had been tilted off its axis by truths that refused to stay hidden, and that meeting felt even more surreal, because there was no shared history to soften the edges, only a shared aftermath that neither of us had asked for. We talked about practical things at first, about work and schedules, and the strange way time seems to stretch and compress after something big breaks your sense of normal. And then, gradually, the conversation drifted toward the harder topics without either of us quite noticing when it happened. There was no bitterness in it, just a kind of mutual recognition that betrayal doesn't look the same from every angle, but it leaves similar marks on the people who have to live with it. When we stood up to leave, there was no promise of friendship or dramatic new beginning, just the quiet understanding that sometimes the most meaningful connections are the ones that exist briefly, for a specific reason, and then let you go back to your separate lives a little less alone than you were before. Looking back now, I can see how easy it would have been to stay in the version of my life that existed before all of this, to keep mistaking familiarity for safety and routine for commitment, and to call that stability without ever asking what it was costing either of us. I don't tell this story because I think I handled everything perfectly, or because I believe there's a clean moral tucked inside it that fits neatly into a sentence, but because it taught me something I couldn't have learned any other way, which is that ignoring the quiet signs doesn't keep things from breaking. It just makes the break louder when it finally comes. I'm still building a future that doesn't look like the one I imagined years ago, and some days that feels like loss and other days it feels like freedom. But either way, it's honest in a way my old life never quite was, and that honesty has become something I'm not willing to trade for comfort again. Time has a strange way of smoothing the sharpest edges without really erasing what caused them, and I started to notice that my days were no longer organized around what had been lost, but around what still felt possible, which was a subtle shift that didn't announce itself with any big moment of clarity. I rearranged my mornings first, walking instead of driving when I could, taking different routes just to remind myself that habits are choices you can revisit, not laws you're sentenced to obey. And in those quiet stretches, I found myself thinking less about how everything had gone wrong and more about how much of my life I'd been living on autopilot. The apartment, once just a temporary place to land, began to feel like a space I could actually shape, not because I bought new furniture or painted the walls, but because I stopped treating it like a waiting room for some version of my old life to return. Friends I hadn't seen in years started showing up again, not out of pity, but because I finally said yes to invitations instead of hiding behind excuses about being busy or tired. And in those conversations, I realized how long I'd been shrinking my world without noticing. There were still nights when silence felt too loud and mornings when I woke up with the reflex to check messages that were no longer part of my life. But those moments passed more quickly now, like weather instead of climate, and that difference mattered more than I'd expected. Work changed too, not in any dramatic, career-defining way, but in the sense that I stopped using it as a place to hide from everything else, and instead started treating it like one part of a life that had room for more than just responsibility. I took on projects that scared me a little, said no to things that didn't, and found that competence feels different when it isn't fueled by the need to prove you're still standing. There were days when I caught myself thinking about the person I used to be, the one who believed stability meant never rocking the boat, and I felt a strange mix of sympathy and frustration toward that version of myself, not because he was weak, but because he was so determined to keep things looking fine that he forgot to ask whether they actually were. I started writing again, not for anyone else and not with any plan to show it to the world, just to see what would come out if I stopped editing my thoughts before they had a chance to exist. And in those pages I found anger, relief, regret, and hope tangled together in ways that didn't always make sense but felt honest in a way I hadn't practiced in years. Occasionally, memories would surface without warning, triggered by something small and stupid like a certain brand of coffee or a song playing in a grocery store. And for a moment I'd be back in a different life, one where I still believed love was mostly about keeping things comfortable and predictable. Those moments didn't hurt the way they used to, but they did remind me that the past doesn't disappear just because you've decided to move forward. It just changes the way it shows up. I learned to let those memories exist without arguing with them, to acknowledge what was real in them without pretending that what followed could have been avoided by wishing harder or paying closer attention to the wrong details. The truth is, some things only become clear after they've already fallen apart, and that doesn't mean they were meaningless. It just means they were unfinished in a way you didn't get to choose. There were also new people, new conversations, new small risks that didn't feel like risks at all compared to what I'd already survived. And I found that connection feels different when you're no longer trying to protect a version of yourself that doesn't quite fit anymore. I didn't rush into anything, not because I was afraid, but because I'd finally learned the difference between moving forward and running away, and that distinction turned out to be more important than any timeline I could set for myself. Some evenings were still quiet in that particular way that reminds you you're alone, but more and more often they were quiet in a way that felt chosen, not imposed, and that shift made all the difference in how I experienced them. I don't pretend that what happened made me wiser in any clean, inspirational way, or that it wrapped itself up into a lesson you could print on a poster and hang on a wall, but it did change the questions I ask myself, and that's probably the closest thing to growth that actually lasts. I ask whether I'm paying attention, whether I'm speaking when something matters instead of saving my honesty for later, whether I'm choosing comfort out of genuine contentment or out of fear of disruption. And those questions don't always have easy answers, but they do keep me awake in my own life in a way I wasn't before. Sometimes I think about how easily all of this could have stayed hidden, how simple it would have been to ignore a few odd details, to accept a story that was convenient instead of one that was true, and to keep moving forward on a path that looked stable from the outside while slowly hollowing out from the inside. That thought doesn't make me grateful for what happened, but it does make me aware of how thin the line is between the life you think you're living and the one you actually are, and how much courage it sometimes takes just to look at that line without turning away. If there's anything I carry with me now, it's not bitterness or even caution so much as a quiet commitment to notice my own life as it's happening, to question routines that feel too easy, and to treat honesty not as a dramatic gesture, but as a daily practice that keeps small fractures from becoming unrecognizable breaks. I don't know exactly where all of this leads, and for once that uncertainty doesn't feel like a threat. It feels like space, like possibility, like the kind of open road you don't need to rush down because you're finally paying attention to the fact that you're the one driving. The strange thing about starting over is that it rarely feels like a clean break, and more like a slow recalibration, a series of small internal adjustments that only become obvious when you look back and realize how differently you're standing in your own life. I noticed it first in the way I made decisions without mentally rehearsing how someone else might react to them, in the way I chose where to spend my weekends, and how to fill my evenings without treating those choices like negotiations. There was a freedom in that, but also a responsibility I hadn't fully appreciated before, because when you stop outsourcing parts of your happiness, you also lose the comfort of blaming someone else when things feel empty. I learned to sit with that discomfort instead of trying to drown it out with noise or distraction. And in that quiet, I started to understand how much of my old life had been built around avoiding difficult conversations, not just with my partner, but with myself. The world didn't suddenly become simpler or kinder, but it did become clearer, and clarity, I found, is its own kind of stability even when it shows you things you would have preferred not to see. There were moments when I wondered who I would have become if none of this had happened, if I'd kept moving forward along the same well-worn tracks, telling myself that consistency was the same thing as commitment, and that predictability was the same thing as safety. That version of me probably would have looked fine from the outside, maybe even successful by the standards people like to measure these things with. But I suspect he would have been slowly shrinking his expectations without ever admitting that's what he was doing. It's unsettling to realize how adaptable you can be to your own dissatisfaction, how easy it is to call something normal just because it's familiar, and how much effort it sometimes takes to admit that you want more than the shape your life has settled into. I don't think I would have asked those questions without being forced to, and while I wouldn't wish the experience on anyone, I can't pretend I didn't need the wake-up call. As time went on, the story stopped feeling like something that had happened to me and started feeling like something I'd moved through, which is a subtle but important difference, because it shifted my role from passive witness to active participant in whatever came next. I began to trust my own judgment again, not in a reckless way, but in a grounded, cautious way that recognized both my capacity to be wrong and my responsibility to try anyway. That trust showed up in small choices at first, then in bigger ones, and each time it held, it reinforced the idea that I wasn't as fragile as I'd thought I was during those first, disorienting weeks. Resilience, I learned, isn't about bouncing back to who you were before. It's about building something that can hold the weight of what you've learned without collapsing under it. I also came to understand that forgiveness, when it arrived at all, didn't come as a gift I offered to someone else so much as a boundary I set for myself, a way of deciding how much space the past was allowed to take up in my present. That didn't mean forgetting or minimizing what had happened, and it definitely didn't mean pretending it hadn't mattered, but it did mean refusing to let old injuries dictate every new decision. Some days that was easy, other days it felt like work, and occasionally it felt like failure. But over time the balance shifted, and the effort required became less about resistance and more about maintenance, like keeping a window clean enough to see through without pretending the weather outside doesn't exist. The future, when I thought about it, no longer looked like a single, fixed destination I was trying to reach, but more like a series of directions I could choose between depending on what mattered to me in that moment. That was both exciting and intimidating, because certainty has a way of feeling safer than possibility, even when it's quietly suffocating you. I made peace with the idea that not knowing exactly how things would turn out wasn't a flaw in the plan. It was the plan, and that the point wasn't to eliminate risk, but to take risks that were honest about what I actually wanted rather than what I thought I was supposed to want. Every so often, I'd think back to the day everything started to unravel, to the small, ordinary moment that set all of this in motion, and I'd be struck by how rarely life announces its turning points with any sense of drama. Most of the time, they arrive disguised as inconveniences, accidents, or minor disruptions, and it's only later that you realize they were invitations to look more closely at the story you were telling yourself. I don't romanticize that day, and I don't feel grateful for the pain it caused, but I do recognize it as the moment I stopped choosing comfort over clarity, and that choice, once made, has a way of echoing forward into everything else. If there's one thing I know now, it's that honesty is less about confrontation and more about alignment, about making sure the life you're living matches the values you claim to hold, even when that alignment costs you something you thought you couldn't afford to lose. I'm still figuring out what that looks like in practice, still making mistakes, still learning where my blind spots are, but I'm no longer pretending they don't exist just because acknowledging them feels inconvenient. That, more than anything, has changed the way I move through the world, and it's a change I intend to keep choosing, even on the days when it would be easier not to. I don't know what the next few years will bring, and I'm finally okay with not turning that uncertainty into a problem that needs solving. There are plans, of course, and hopes, and a growing list of things I want to try simply because they're mine to try. But there's also an openness to being surprised, to letting life expand in directions I couldn't have predicted back when everything felt so tightly mapped out. That openness doesn't make me careless. It makes me attentive, and attention, I've learned, is one of the quiet foundations of a life that actually feels like it belongs to you. When I think about who I am now compared to who I was then, the difference isn't dramatic in the ways people like to tell stories about. There's no single moment of triumph or neat resolution, just a steady shift toward living with my eyes open instead of half closed. I'm more careful with my time, more deliberate with my words, and more willing to ask uncomfortable questions before they turn into unspoken resentments. And while that doesn't guarantee anything like permanent happiness, it does create a kind of integrity that I hadn't realized I was missing. And maybe that's the real ending here, not a clean break or a perfect new beginning, but the decision to stay awake in your own life, to notice when something doesn't fit, and to trust yourself enough to do something about it even when the outcome isn't certain. I didn't choose the way this chapter started, but I do get to choose how the next ones are written, and for the first time in a long while, that choice feels less like a burden and more like a quiet, steady promise to myself that I intend to keep.